Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In our previous lectures, we've talked about the growing sense of American escalation of the war during the Lyndon Johnson administration, through the process of the Gulf of Tonkin incident and resolution, and the bombing campaigns after in Operation Rolling Thunder. In this lecture, we'll take a broader look at some of the factors that contributed to America's commitment in Vietnam, and ultimately what led them into what became a quagmire they could not escape from. On March 29, 1965, a car bomb blasted the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. 20 people were killed, and more than 100 were injured in this bombing. After the bombing, Lyndon Johnson committed to further expansion of the war. He sent some 20,000 more combat troops into South Vietnam and expanded the air war in North Vietnam, deployed more Marines around Da Nang, including offensive operations, which we'll discuss in future lectures. While a large majority of Americans still supported these operations, in the spring of 1965, we begin to see the beginnings of an anti-war movement. The words hawk and dove were becoming more common in the country. Some wanted Lyndon Johnson to do even more, to commit even more to the conflict. Others wanted to end the war immediately. On university campuses, professors held teach-ins to educate the public and debate Washington's war policies. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, was established in April 1965 and began organizing protests. We will talk, of course, about the anti-war movement much more in future lectures. On April 7th, 1965, Lyndon Johnson gave a major speech at the Johns Hopkins University about his actions. He reaffirmed American actions in South Vietnam and stated that we would stay as long as necessary and use whatever force necessary. He also spoke of readiness for peace and that Hanoi had rejected peace proposals repeatedly. Not long after that speech, the term credibility gap came into use. A growing number of Americans began to doubt whether the Lyndon Johnson administration was being entirely candid about the war effort. And of course, future reporting would show that they had not been. On April 8th, the North Vietnamese Premier, Pham Van Dong, offered a proposal for peace negotiations, with several conditions. One, that Americans accept the 1954 Geneva Accords and honor the promised elections. Two, that the Americans withdraw their forces from South Vietnam. And three, that they would allow for Viet Cong influence in South Vietnamese government. Of course, Lyndon Johnson and the Americans would not consider such a proposal. Neither side really was interested in a settlement. Both would not budge on key points, and both were confident that victory could only be secured militarily. On April 20th, McNamara and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others gathered at a conference in Honolulu to discuss the next phase of action. In Honolulu, Westmoreland requested still more troops and air support. He sought authorization to deploy troops in unrestricted offensive operations. The next day, Johnson approved another 82,000 troops to join the 33,500 already serving in South Vietnam. On May 4th, Congress approved $700 million to support the U.S. military operations in Vietnam. While some were opposed to the escalation, they couldn't vote against funding the soldiers already in the field. This created an awkward political dilemma, and Lyndon Johnson used this vote as an endorsement of his policies. In South Vietnam, the ARVN forces were disintegrating. Desertion rates were high. Viet Cong forces continued to grow stronger and launched several attacks against ARVN installations. These were crushing defeats. Westmoreland was convinced that only the introduction of large numbers of American troops could save the war effort. he requested an additional 150,000 troops and more expanded offensive strategies. In July 1965, during a week of intense discussions with his staff, Lyndon Johnson made some of his most fateful decisions in escalating the war. He granted Westmoreland 175,000 troops total and authority to carry out all operations he thought necessary. He had now completely broken his campaign promise that the United States boys would not fight a land war in Southeast Asia. We were committed to an open-ended, large-scale war. The generals in Saigon were not even consulted about these latest decisions. In a press conference on July 28th, Johnson continued to mislead the public. He insisted that he hadn't changed his policies, suggesting that the U.S. role continued to be only advisory and supporting ARVN troops. He didn't mention Westmoreland's ability to wage all war he deemed necessary. At that time, while admittedly misled by Lyndon Johnson, a poll showed that 80% of Americans thought the war would end quickly with an American victory. None predicted American defeat and withdrawal. American defeat was simply inconceivable at that time. Before we move to a full discussion of what became the abyss or the quagmire of American entanglement in Vietnam in the years 1965 to 68, we need to pause for a few moments and consider the all-important question of why the Americans had become entangled in this conflict. Why had they Americanized what had been a civil war, an internal war in Vietnam? Well, we've discussed most of these reasons, but let's bring things together now. There was the continued belief in the domino theory, the idea that if South Vietnam fell to communism, then Laos and Cambodia, the next nation and the next, would continue to fall. There was also the fear of humiliation and defeat should Americans have to leave South Vietnam without a victory. This would also be accompanied by the loss of American credibility and honor in war. There was also the potential loss of the economic resources of South Vietnam and the rest of Southeast Asia. And there was simply an overarching sense of mission, the nobility of their cause in Asia, the fact that America and its policies represented all that was good and right. There is a healthy dose of ethnocentrism in American decision-making at this time. We'll teach those South Vietnamese how to really fight a war. There's an arrogance as well. There was also the political fear that we were going to lose Vietnam as China had been lost, and ultimately that American policies and belief in democracy and capitalism would crumble around the world. And finally, there was a lack of understanding that the South Vietnamese government truly had no popular support, and that Ho Chi Minh was vastly popular. There's an underestimation of how popular Ho Chi Minh and communist policies really were in Vietnam, and of course, a lack of acknowledgement that those policies were legitimate and might actually represent the best alternative for South Vietnam. Escalation pointed the Americans down a long road with an undetermined outcome. In mid-1965, American strategy in Vietnam was unclear. As one historian has put it very well, boiled down to its essence, American strategy was simply to put more U.S. troops into South Vietnam and see what happened. Escalation was also accompanied by several serious miscalculations on the part of the Americans. First, they grossly underestimated their enemy. They couldn't even consider the possibility that they might not prevail. As well, they overestimated their own military capabilities. The belief that simply in applying greater force, American forces would prevail. And they overestimated the willingness of the American people to support a conflict indefinitely. They also regarded Vietnam in the same light as other Cold War issues, especially containment in Europe. But Vietnam was different. The major theme in Vietnamese history was resistance to foreign intrusion and repelling superior enemies. Few, if any, in Johnson's administration considered those ideas. And finally, Johnson believed that he could fight a limited war abroad and carry out the Great Society at home. Eventually, forced to choose between the two, he would sacrifice the Great Society at home, only to realize that he would lose the war in Vietnam as well. Thus the Americans found themselves sinking deeper and deeper into the quagmire of Vietnam. In our next lecture, and several others to follow, we'll talk about that process of the quagmire and what it meant for the Americans to be bogged down in this conflict in Vietnam.